Hi everyone, thank you for viewing our presentation on Lloyd v. Alpha Phi Alpha and Cornell University, presented by myself, Bailey Spellman, and Eleni Wolf. This case deals with hazing, university liability, and the legal responsibilities institutions may have towards student organizations. It is particularly relevant for professionals working in higher education and student affairs, as it raises important questions about how much responsibility universities have for the behavior of students participating in campus organizations. Here's a quick overview of the topics we'll be discussing. First, we'll begin with the facts of the case, including the individuals and organizations involved and the events that led to the lawsuit. Next, we'll discuss the procedural history, explaining how the case made its way through the court system. Then we'll review the final decision of the court and explain the legal reasoning behind that decision. After that, we'll discuss the significance of the case, including what it tells us about university liability and student conduct. And finally, we'll conclude by explaining how this case applies to the student affairs profession, particularly administrators responsible for student organizations and risk management. So starting off with the facts, the main parties involved in this case include plaintiff Sylvester Lloyd Jr., who was a college student at the time of the events. Lloyd brought legal action against two primary defendants. The first defendant was Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, specifically members of its chapter at Cornell University. Alpha Phi Alpha is historically significant because it is the oldest African American fraternity in the United States, founded in 1906. The Cornell chapter is also historically important, as it is the fraternity's oldest chartered local chapter. The second defendant in the case was Cornell University itself, which Lloyd argued should share legal responsibility for the injuries he experienced during the fraternity's initiation process. The events that led to the lawsuit began in the fall of 1994, when Lloyd transferred to Cornell University as a student. During his first semester on campus, he decided to pledge Alpha Phi Alpha, meaning that he began the process of becoming a member of the fraternity. At the time, both the National Alpha Phi Alpha organization and Cornell University had official policies that prohibited hazing. Despite these policies, Lloyd alleged that he was subjected to multiple hazing activities during the fraternity's pledging and initiation process. According to Lloyd, these activities included several serious forms of mistreatment, including physical abuse, specifically beatings and other physically painful activities, psychological coercion, meaning that he was pressured or intimidated into participating in certain behaviors, and humiliating conduct, which Lloyd believed was designed to degrade or embarrass pledges. As a result of these experiences, Lloyd stated that he suffered both physical injuries and emotional distress, which ultimately led him to pursue legal action. Following these events, Lloyd filed two separate lawsuits. The first lawsuit was filed against the Alpha Phi Alpha National Organization, the Cornell chapter, the Alumni Association, and several individual fraternity members. And the second lawsuit was filed directly against Cornell University itself. Within these lawsuits, Lloyd asserted several legal claims. One of the primary claims was negligence, arguing that fraternity members and the organization acted carelessly by engaging in hazing activities that caused harm. Lloyd also brought a claim of negligent supervision against Cornell University. In this claim, he argued that the university failed to adequately supervise and regulate fraternity activities on its campus. Another claim involved premises liability, in which Lloyd argued that Cornell should be held responsible for what happened because some of the hazing activities occurred in a fraternity house that was owned by the university. And finally, Lloyd included related tort claims connected to the injuries he said he suffered during the hazing process. The central argument made by Lloyd was that Cornell University should be held legally responsible for his injuries. His reasoning was based on the idea that universities have a duty to protect students from dangerous activities, particularly when those activities occur within officially recognized student organizations. Lloyd argued that Cornell exercised a significant amount of control and oversight over fraternities on campus. For example, the university recognized these organizations as official student groups, allowed them to operate on campus, and established rules governing student conduct. Lloyd also pointed out that the fraternity house where some of the hazing occurred was owned by Cornell University. Because the university owned the property, he argued that it had a responsibility to ensure that the environment was safe and that illegal or harmful activities did not take place there. Additionally, Lloyd emphasized that Cornell had the authority to monitor, regulate, and discipline fraternities through its student conduct policies. Because of this authority, Lloyd argued that a quote-unquote special relationship existed between the university and its students. He claimed that Cornell either knew or should have known that hazing was a potential risk within fraternity initiation practices. Therefore, according to Lloyd, the university should be held liable for failing to supervise the fraternity adequately or intervene before the harm occurred.
The procedural history of this case begins when the plaintiff filed negligence claims against both Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity and Cornell University. The lawsuit arose from injuries the plaintiff alleged were sustained during hazing activities connected to the fraternity's pledging process. The plaintiff argued that these injuries were the result of negligent conduct and that both the fraternity and the university should be held legally responsible. Specifically, the plaintiff claimed that Cornell University should bear some responsibility because the fraternity operated within the university environment and was recognized as a student organization. The argument was that the university had some level of authority over student organizations and therefore should have taken steps to prevent the harmful conduct. At the trial court level, Cornell University responded by filing a motion to dismiss the claims against the institution. In this motion, Cornell argued that even if the alleged facts were true, the university did not owe a legal duty that would make it responsible for the actions of the fraternity. The trial court agreed with Cornell's argument and granted the motion to dismiss. The court determined that Cornell did not have a legally sufficient duty of care toward the plaintiff in this situation and did not exercise the type of direct control over the fraternity's activities that would justify imposing institutional liability. Because of this finding, the claims against Cornell were dismissed at this stage of the litigation. However, the claims against Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity itself were allowed to proceed since the fraternity was directly involved in the alleged hazing activities. The case was then reviewed by the appellate division after the plaintiff challenged the dismissal of Cornell University. Upon reviewing the lower court's decision, the appellate court ultimately affirmed the trial court's ruling. The appellate division concluded that Cornell's relationship with the fraternity did not create the level of supervision or operational control required to establish a legal duty of care. Although Cornell did have certain forms of regulatory authority over student organizations, such as the ability to recognize organizations, establish policies, and impose disciplinary sanctions, the court emphasized that this type of authority is different from direct supervision of an organization's internal activities. The court determined that Cornell's regulatory role did not rise to the level necessary to hold the university legally responsible for the fraternity's conduct. As a result, the appellate court upheld the dismissal of Cornell University from the lawsuit, reinforcing the principle that universities are generally not liable for the actions of independent student organizations unless the institution exercises substantial control over the specific activity where the harm occurred.
The final decision in this case was issued by the United States District Court for the Northern District of New York. After reviewing the facts of the case and the legal arguments presented by both sides, the court ultimately ruled in favor of Cornell University. The judge dismissed the claims that had been brought against the university, meaning that Cornell was not held legally responsible for Lloyd's injuries. The court's reasoning centered on several important legal principles. First, the court examined whether Cornell had a legal duty to supervise or control the fraternity's initiation activities. Under New York law, individuals or institutions are generally not responsible for preventing the actions of third parties unless a specific type of relationship exists that creates such a duty. This is often referred to as a special relationship. In this case, the judge determined that no special relationship existed between Cornell University and the fraternity members involved in the hazing. The court also addressed the legal concept of in loco parentis, which means in the place of a parent. Historically, colleges were sometimes viewed as acting in a parental role for students. However, modern courts generally reject this idea because college students are considered legal adults who are responsible for their own decisions. Because Lloyd voluntarily chose to join the fraternity and participate in its activities, the court determined that Cornell could not automatically be held responsible for those actions. Another important factor considered by the court was whether Cornell had direct knowledge that hazing was taking place. Lloyd argued that the university should have been aware that hazing might occur during the fraternity initiations. However, the court found that there was no evidence showing that Cornell had actual or constructive knowledge that hazing was occurring at that specific time. Although the fraternity was a recognized student organization and the house was owned by the university, the court determined that these facts alone were not enough to establish legal liability. As a result, the court granted Cornell's motion to dismiss, meaning the case against the university was ended before it proceeded further. Because the case was decided in a federal district court, it was determined by a single judge, and therefore there were no concurring or dissenting opinions.
This case is particularly important because it helps define the limits of university liability. When it comes to student organizations, in its ruling, the court emphasized that universities are generally not legally responsible for the actions of independent student groups, even when those groups operate on campus and are affiliated with the institution. Organizations such as fraternities are typically treated as legally separate entities, which significantly limits the university's exposure to negligence claims. In the context of this case, that meant Cornell University was not held liable for the hazing injuries suffered by the plaintiff. Although the fraternity was associated with the university community, the court determined that the institution did not exercise the type of direct control over the organization's activities that would create a legal duty of care. The broader significance of its ruling lies in how it clarifies institutional responsibility. Universities may establish policies, implement regulations, and offer educational programs aimed at preventing misconduct, including hazing. However, the court made it clear that these types of preventive or regulatory efforts alone do not automatically create a legal duty that would make the institution responsible for the actions of independent student organizations. For professionals working in higher education, particularly administrations, legal counsel, and student affairs practitioners, this distinction is critical. It helps guide how universities structure policies, oversight mechanisms, and risk management strategies while balancing institutional responsibility with the autonomy of student organizations. Another important takeaway from this case is how the court clarified when a university actually has a duty to intervene in student organization activities. The court explained that for a university to be held legally responsible, it must have some level of direct control or significant involvement in the activity where the harm occurred. In other words, simply being the institution where the organization exists is not enough to establish liability. The court looked at the role Cornell University played in relation to the fraternity and determined that the university's involvement was primarily regulatory rather than supervisory. For example, Cornell had taken steps to address hazing by publishing anti-hazing materials and offering educational seminars designed to inform students about the risks and consequences of hazing. While these efforts demonstrate that the university was attempting to promote student safety and awareness, the court found that these measures did not amount to the level of direct supervision required to create a legal duty to oversee fraternity pledging activities. The broader impact of this decision is that universities are not automatically required to supervise every activity conducted by student organizations. Instead, liability generally depends on whether the institution exercised substantial control over the specific activity in which the harm occurred. This case also became important as a legal precedent in later cases involving university negligence and student conduct. Courts frequently reference this case when they are trying to determine whether a college or university has a legal duty to control the behavior of students or student organizations. When courts analyze similar situations, they often focus on two main questions. The first question is whether the university exercised direct control or supervision over the activity where the harm occurred. If the institution was actively managing or supervising the activity, a duty of care may be more likely to exist. The second question courts consider is whether the university contributed to or had knowledge of a dangerous condition on its property. If the institution was aware of a hazardous situation and failed to address it, that could increase the likelihood of institutional liability. By establishing these considerations, this case has served as a reference point for later lawsuits involving hazing, student safety, and campus liability. It It helps courts determine when a university's role crosses the line from general oversight into a level of control that would create legal responsibility. Beyond its legal significance, the case also contributed to broader conversations about hazing and student safety on college campuses. The circumstances surrounding the case highlighted the serious physical and psychological risks associated with fraternity hazing, drawing greater public and institutional attention to the dangers of these practices. Cases like this have raised important questions about the roles universities should play in protecting students. One of the central debates is whether the institutions should take greater responsibility for preventing harm within student organizations, even when those organizations operate as legally independent entities. Another key question is how much authority universities should exercise in regulating Greek life while still allowing student organizations some level of autonomy. Similar incidents at other universities have contributed to fuel this debate. For example, the hazing death of student Maxwell Groover at Louisiana State University led to criminal charges against fraternity members and ultimately contributed to the passage of stronger anti-hazing legislation known as the Max Groover Act. Another example is the death of Stone Foltz at Bowling Green State University. Following that case, the university permanently expelled the fraternity chapter involved, and the family later reached multi-million-dollar settlements with both the university and other defendants. Cases like these demonstrate that hazing incidents can lead not only to criminal charges and civil lawsuits, but also to institutional reforms and stronger state laws. Today, many universities have responded by implementing stricter anti-hazing policies, improved reporting systems, and more comprehensive disciplinary procedures for organizations that violate campus safety rules. Overall, Lloyd versus Alpha Phi Alpha remains part of a larger conversation about accountability, risk management, and student safety in higher education. It illustrates how courts, universities, and policymakers continue to navigate the balance between institutional oversight and the independence of student organizations. This case also had important implications for how universities approach the regulation of Greek life and student organizations. The court's decision reinforced the legal understanding that fraternities and similar groups function with a degree of independence from the institutions where they are located. Even when these organizations are officially recognized by a university, they are still genuinely viewed as separate entities responsible for their own internal activities. As a result, many universities began reassessing how they manage risk related to fraternities and sororities. Rather than attempting to directly supervise the day-to-day operations of these organizations, institutions have increasingly focused on developing stronger preventive frameworks. For instance, universities have expanded and clarified anti-hazing policies to more explicitly define unacceptable behaviors and outline disciplinary consequences. Many institutions have also increased oversight of fraternity housing, particularly when those residences are affiliated with or located near campus. In addition, student organizations are often required to participate in risk management education that covers topics such as hazing prevention, alcohol use, and responsible organizational leadership. Over time, these strategies have shifted the way universities approach regulation. Instead of direct supervision, institutions tend to prioritize clear policy development, consistent enforcement, and proactive education as methods for promoting safety and reducing institutional risk. This case is especially important when we think about the role of student affairs professionals in supporting student safety and managing risk on college campuses. While the court made it clear that universities are not automatically legally liable for the misconduct of student organizations, the case highlights that prevention and proactive engagement are essential. Student affairs professionals are often the individuals responsible for developing and enforcing the policies that guide student organizations. One of the most important responsibilities is ensuring that anti-hazing policies are clearly established and consistently enforced. It is not enough for these policies to simply exist. Students and organizations must clearly understand the expectations placed on them and the consequences that follow when those expectations are violated. Another key strategy is providing mandatory training for student leaders. Risk management and leadership development programs help students understand the responsibilities that come with leading an organization. These trainings can address issues such as hazing prevention, alcohol safety, and responsible decision-making, helping student leaders create safer organizational cultures. Student affairs professionals also play a major role in maintaining reporting systems that allow students to raise concerns about unsafe or prohibited activities. Early reporting is critical because it allows institutions to intervene before harmful behaviors escalate into serious incidents. Additionally, professionals in student affairs can promote cultural change across campuses. Through workshops, awareness campaigns, and bystander intervention programs, students can be encouraged to challenge harmful traditions and support safer alternatives. Ultimately, the goal is not just to reduce institutional liability, but to create a campus environment where students feel supported, organizations operate responsibly, and safety is prioritized. By combining clear policies, education, and proactive monitoring, student affairs professionals can play a central role in preventing harm and protecting both students and the institution.